In the North Atlantic, about 230 miles west of the Scottish coast, there is a rock. Not an island, a rock. It is about 65 feet wide, about 70 feet tall, and its summit is a slanted, wave-battered platform smaller than a tennis court. It has no soil, no fresh water, no vegetation, apart from a thin film of algae. Nothing lives on it permanently except seabirds, and even they only use it as a resting place. It is, by almost any measure a human being could apply, one of the most useless pieces of land on the surface of the earth. And yet, 4 countries have fought over it for decades. The United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, Iceland, 4 modern nations, 4 members of the international community, tangled for more than half a century in a dispute over a granite pinnacle in the middle of the ocean that no human being can inhabit, a rock so small that in a heavy storm, waves wash completely over its summit. The United Kingdom went as far as sending the Royal Navy to claim it. It was, and this is not an exaggeration, the last territorial expansion of the British Empire. The empire on which the sun never set. The empire of India, of Australia, of a quarter of the planet, closed its 5 centuries of expansion by annexing a wet rock with room for about 4 people standing. Why? Why would 4 countries spend decades of diplomacy, legal argument, and naval resources on a place where no one can live? The answer is not on the rock. The answer is underneath it, and around it, in one of the strangest legal battles of the modern world. A battle in which the prize is invisible, the territory is unlivable, and the rules changed halfway through the game. This is the story of Rockall. Welcome to Where the World Ends. To understand this story, the first thing you need to understand is how alone this rock is. Rockall is the eroded core of an extinct volcano, a plug of granite standing in the open North Atlantic at roughly 57 degrees north. The nearest permanently inhabited place is the archipelago of St Kilda, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, itself one of the most remote places in Europe, abandoned by its own population in 1930. From Rockall, the Scottish mainland lies more than 260 miles away. Ireland is about 260 miles to the southeast. In every other direction, there is nothing but ocean for hundreds of miles. The rock itself is the last visible fragment of something much older and much larger. Around 60 million years ago, as the North Atlantic was tearing itself open and Greenland was separating from Europe, this region was a zone of massive volcanic activity. Rockall is the eroded plug of one of those ancient volcanoes, a fist of exceptionally hard granite that survived while the ocean ground away everything softer around it. Geologists even named a mineral first identified in its stone: rockallite. Beneath the waves, the rock continues downward as a huge submerged bank, a drowned plateau stretching for tens of thousands of square miles. What you see above the surface is the tip of a mountain whose body lies under the ocean, a detail that will matter enormously later in this story, because nations do not only argue about what is above the water. The sea around it is one of the most violent in the world. This stretch of the North Atlantic is a factory of storms. Low-pressure systems sweep across it constantly, and waves there are among the largest ever recorded in the world's oceans. In the year 2000, a British research vessel operating in the Rockall Trough measured waves of nearly 100 feet. Among the biggest scientifically recorded waves in history, taller than a 10-story building. During the worst winter storms, spray and green water wash over the entire rock, all 70 feet of it. Any structure placed on the summit, any flag, any marker, tends to be scraped off by the ocean within a few seasons. Landing on Rockall is extraordinarily difficult even in calm weather. There is no beach, no harbour, no flat approach, only sheer walls of wet granite rising straight from deep water, with swell surging against them even on the gentlest days. Fewer people have set foot on Rockall than have been to space. Most attempts to land fail. Helicopters can hover over the summit, boats must time the swell and hope. For centuries, that was all Rockall needed to be, a hazard, a thing to avoid. Sailors knew it as a sea mark and a killer of ships, a white-capped fang that appeared out of the fog exactly where no land should be. The first recorded landing did not happen until 1811, when a Royal Navy officer named Basil Hall led a small boat party to the summit and nearly died on the way back. When fog and rising seas separated the boats from their ship for hours. Even reaching the rock, in other words, was an achievement men wrote reports about. And the rock collected victims. In 1904, a Danish steamer called the SS Norge, carrying nearly 800 emigrants, many of them families from Denmark, Norway and Russia, bound for a new life in New York, struck Helen's Reef, a submerged spur of rock lying just off Rockall. The ship went down in about 20 minutes. The lifeboats could hold only a fraction of the passengers. Survivors drifted for days in open boats in the North Atlantic before being picked up. More than 600 people died in the cold water, within sight of the pinnacle. It remains one of the worst civilian maritime disasters of the North Atlantic before the Titanic, and it happened at the foot of a rock almost nobody in the world had ever heard of. For the families of the drowned, Rockall was never a curiosity or a legal argument. It was a gravestone. A useless pinnacle in a lethal sea then, so why did the British Empire claim it? The answer begins in the Cold War. In the early 1950s, the United Kingdom was developing its own nuclear deterrent, and it planned to test guided missiles from a range in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The military planners, looking at their maps, found a problem. A tiny, unclaimed rock out in the Atlantic, sitting within observation distance of the missile trajectories. The fear, as it was framed at the time, was specific and very much of its era, that the Soviet Union could place observers, a ship, instruments, even men, on or around that unclaimed rock, and use it to spy on British missile tests. Rockall was a no-man's land, and a no-man's land 200 miles from a secret weapons range was suddenly intolerable. So, in September of 1955, the Royal Navy ship Vidal, fittingly a survey vessel, sailed to Rockall with orders signed under the authority of the Queen. On the morning of the 18th of September, a small party was put onto the rock by helicopter. 2 naval officers, a sergeant, and a civilian naturalist named James Fisher, one of the best-known ornithologists in Britain, who had long been fascinated by the rock and its seabirds. Clinging to the guano-slick summit, they cemented a brass plaque into the granite, hoisted the Union Jack on a flagpole drilled into the stone, and read out a formal proclamation annexing the island of Rockall to the British Crown, in the name of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Fisher, with a naturalist's sense of humor, later described the scene of empire's final conquest. A few cold men, a flag, and thousands of indifferent seabirds. It is worth pausing on this image. 1955. The British Empire is dissolving, India gone, the colonies moving one by one toward independence, the imperial age visibly ending, and the final act of territorial annexation in the entire history of that empire, the last time Britain ever expanded, is 3 men on a storm-swept rock the size of a living room, cementing a plaque while the Atlantic heaves beneath them. The empire that once claimed continents closed its story by claiming a pinnacle that cannot hold a garden. In the years that followed, Britain kept reinforcing the claim with physical gestures, each one a small war against the ocean. In 1971, a Royal Navy demolition team blasted flat a section of the summit ledge to create a platform, and a navigation beacon was installed on it. A light, blinking alone in the Atlantic night, whose main practical function was arguably not navigation at all, but occupation, proof that Britain maintained something on the rock. In 1972, the United Kingdom formalised the annexation with an Act of Parliament, the Island of Rockall Act, declaring Rockall part of Scotland, administratively attached to the Isle of Harris in the Outer Hebrides. On paper, the matter was settled. Rockall was British soil, as British as London. A member of Parliament, during the debates of that era, summed up the absurdity better than any critic could. William Ross, then Secretary of State for Scotland, told the House of Commons, "More people have landed on the moon than have landed on Rockall." He was not exaggerating. At that point, it was literally true, except that almost nobody else agreed. And the reason the disagreement mattered, the reason it still matters, had nothing to do with the rock itself. If places like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, this channel exists exactly for that. Every week we document one of the most remote, disputed or forbidden places on Earth, with real research and verified facts. The subscribe button is right below, so you don't miss the next one. In the second half of the 20th century, something changed in the way nations think about the sea. For most of history, a country's sovereignty ended a cannon shot from its coast, 3 nautical miles. The open ocean belonged to no one. But as technology made it possible to drill for oil under the seabed and to fish industrially hundreds of miles from shore, coastal nations began to claim economic rights over vast stretches of ocean. This process culminated in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the global treaty that, among many other things, created the concept of the exclusive economic zone, a belt of sea extending 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline, in which that country holds the exclusive rights to fish, drill, and exploit whatever lies in the water and under the seabed. 200 nautical miles from every piece of coastline, including islands. Suddenly, the mathematics of tiny islands changed completely. A single rock in the right place, if it counted as an island, could generate an exclusive economic zone of more than 150,000 square miles of ocean, an area larger than the United Kingdom itself. The most useless pinnacle, the most miserable outcrop, became a potential anchor for a circle of ocean rights 200 miles in radius. And under the waters around Rockall, geologists believed there might be oil and gas. Around it, some of the richest fishing grounds in the North Atlantic. This is when Rockall stopped being a joke and became a prize. If Rockall was a British island, Britain could, in theory, claim an enormous zone of the Atlantic around it. Ireland, Denmark, through the Faroe Islands, and Iceland all had their own overlapping claims to the surrounding seabed, a vast underwater plateau known as the Rockall Bank and the Hatton-Rockall area. 4 countries, 4 sets of lines drawn on the map of the ocean, all overlapping, all incompatible. And then, in a twist that very few territorial disputes ever get, the rules of the game changed, and the prize evaporated in the most ironic way possible. UNCLOS, the same treaty that created the 200-mile zones, includes a clause written precisely for places like this. Article 121, Paragraph 3. Rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own shall have no exclusive economic zone or continental shelf. Read that again, and then look at Rockall. No soil, no water, no possibility of habitation. It is almost as if the clause had been written with a photograph of Rockall on the table. Under the modern law of the sea, Rockall is the textbook example of a rock that generates nothing, no economic zone, no continental shelf rights. A 12-mile territorial sea around the rock itself. And that is all. The United Kingdom eventually accepted this. When it ratified UNCLOS in 1997, it formally dropped the claim to an exclusive economic zone based on Rockall. It was a quiet capitulation, announced without ceremony, but its meaning was enormous. The last annexation of the British Empire, made to secure a strategic asset, turned out, under the new rules, to secure almost nothing. Britain keeps the rock. The rock grants no ocean. Ireland's position throughout all of this has been a masterpiece of diplomatic restraint with a blade inside it. Dublin has never made a formal claim to Rockall itself, and has never recognized the British one either. The Irish position, repeated for decades, is that a rock which cannot sustain human life should belong to no one and generate nothing, and that Irish rights in the surrounding waters flow from Ireland's own coast, not from anyone's pinnacle. An Irish official once put it with memorable dryness, noting that Ireland had no wish to annex Rockall. The dispute, he implied, was over an absurdity. And yet when Scottish fisheries patrols began warning Irish trawlers away from the waters within 12 miles of the rock, Dublin's response was immediate and sharp. Irish boats had fished those waters for generations, and Ireland recognized no British territorial sea around Rockall. The two neighbors, allies, trading partners, friends in every other respect, still do not agree to this day on what those 12 miles of water are. But here is the part that keeps the dispute alive into the present day. Dropping the zone claim did not settle who owns the waters and the seabed of the wider Rockall area. Those claims now run through other legal channels based on continental shelves and coastlines, and they still overlap. Ireland has never recognized British sovereignty over the rock itself. Denmark and Iceland maintain their positions on the seabed plateau. And every few years, the dispute flares again, most visibly over fishing, when Scottish authorities warn Irish boats away from the waters around Rockall, and Dublin replies that it recognizes no such boundary. 4 countries. 1 rock. Still unresolved, more than half a century later. There is another thread in this story, stranger and more human than the diplomacy. The tiny list of people who have actually lived on Rockall. Because the legal argument, can this rock sustain human habitation, created a bizarre incentive. If someone could live on Rockall, even briefly, it might strengthen the argument that it was more than a bare rock. And beyond the law, there was something older, the sheer, irrational pull of an impossible place. In 1985, a former British soldier named Tom McClean, a veteran of the Special Forces and a record-breaking ocean rower, a man who had already crossed the Atlantic alone in a rowing boat, had himself landed on Rockall and lived on it for 40 days. In a small plywood survival capsule bolted to the summit ledge. Alone, on a slab of granite in the open Atlantic, with waves detonating against the rock beneath him and storms rolling through one after another, he endured isolation and cold. Partly, he said openly, to affirm Britain's claim to the rock. He was resupplied by boat when the sea allowed, which was rarely. 40 days on a surface smaller than most living rooms, with the nearest other human being hundreds of miles away. In 1997, the environmental organization Greenpeace staged one of the most theatrical protests in its history. Its activists landed on Rockall, installed a solar-powered survival capsule on the summit, and occupied the rock for a total of 42 days at the time, the longest anyone had ever stayed. They declared it the sovereign territory of a new micronation they called Waveland, and offered citizenship to anyone who pledged allegiance to the cause of protecting the oceans, a protest against oil exploration in the surrounding waters. The gesture was deliberately pointed if Britain claimed this rock to anchor oil rights. Then seizing the rock was seizing the argument. The British government, with what observers described as studied indifference, declined to be provoked. The authorities essentially shrugged and noted that the activists, by occupying British territory, were merely exercising the right of any person to stand on British soil. Thousands of people around the world signed up as citizens of a nation whose entire territory was a rock they would never see. Waveland eventually faded when its administrative sponsor went bankrupt. A micronation undone, not by war or treaty, but by paperwork. And in 2014, an adventurer named Nick Hancock set the record that still stands, 45 days alone on Rockall, in a modified plastic water tank he called the Rock Pod, anchored to the same blasted ledge where the beacon sits, raising money for veterans' charities. His first attempt, a year earlier, had been defeated before it began. The swell made landing impossible, and the expedition had to turn back within sight of the rock. A reminder that Rockall does not grant access simply because a man has planned for it. On his second attempt, he made it ashore, hauled his pod and supplies up the cliff, and settled in. He watched storms build walls of white water against the granite. At one point, early in a previous expedition season, a wave had swept equipment from the ledge. On Rockall, the ocean audits everything you bring. 45 days. That is the record for the most inhabited this place has ever been, and it required a purpose-built survival pod bolted to the stone, months of planning, and a measure of solitude very few human beings have ever chosen voluntarily. 3 men, a tent of activists, a survival capsule. That is the entire habitation history of the territory 4 nations argue about. There are private apartments with more residents than Rockall has had in its whole existence. So what is Rockall, in the end? Strip away the flags and the treaties, and you are left with something almost philosophical. Rockall is a mirror. It shows, with a clarity no inhabited territory ever could, what a territorial claim actually is when you remove every human justification. There is no population to protect, no culture to preserve, no history of settlement, no graves, no villages, no language. There is nothing on Rockall that any nation could claim to be defending, except the claim itself. 4 countries argued over it anyway, because the modern world had turned coordinates into currency, because a dot of granite in the right place could once anchor an empire of water. And when the law changed and the prize dissolved, the arguments did not stop, they simply moved to the seabed, where they continue quietly to this day, in submissions to United Nations commissions, in overlapping charts of the Hatton-Rockall Plateau, in diplomatic notes about fishing boats. The United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark and Iceland have held rounds of talks about that drowned plateau for decades. They have never fully resolved it. The dispute over Rockall has now outlived the empire that annexed it, most of the men who landed on it, and the Cold War fear that started everything. There is even a folk memory that predates all of it. In the oral tradition of the Scottish Islands, and in the poetry of Ireland, the lonely rock in the west appears under older names, a place at the edge of the known, half real and half legend. Long before any government wanted Rockall, fishermen and storytellers had already decided what it was. The last thing in the world. The lawyers, in a sense, arrived late to a conclusion the sailors had reached centuries earlier. The rock itself takes no notice. The beacon on its summit blinks. The gannets and guillemets rest on it between dives, as they have for thousands of years. The storms come through and wash it clean of whatever plaques and flags the latest expedition bolted on. The brass plate cemented there in 1955 by the last annexation party of the British Empire was eventually torn away by the sea, as almost everything placed on Rockall eventually is. Perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Nations drew lines around this rock, sent navies to it, wrote it into laws and treaties and acts of parliament, and the Atlantic, season by season, keeps erasing every trace of all of it, as if the ocean itself were filing a rival claim, older and more patient than any of the four. There are places the world forgot to talk about. Every week, we document one of them. If you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe. The button is right below. This is where the world ends.